Hello! Welcome back to the channel. My name is Meredith. I don't know if you guys can tell, but this is not our normal setup. I am in fact kneeling on my bed in the most uncomfortable and precarious position. Actually, I'm gonna rearrange. All right, I've got a booster seat going here out of pillows, and now we're ready to go. So a while back, I put a survey in the description of my new moon video, and today we're gonna be going over the results. I got about 100 responses. I think it was like 110 or something like that. So we're a little ways off of having a good sample size for the number of Twilight readers there are in the world. Just a tad, just a tiny bit off. But if it's all right with you, this is the only time I'm gonna mention that. This video instantly becomes no fun if on every single stat I show you, I just say, well, it could be variance, it could be a bit of an error. We're gonna goof around a bit, we're gonna have a little bit of fun, and maybe we're gonna learn something about ourselves in the process. So sit back, relax, grab a snack, and let's get going. Now, the main focus of this study is to deduce whether or not a new reader is going to be a member of Team Jacob or Team Edward based off of a few key factors. The first of those factors is age. You can't really see the word up there. Sorry, I didn't trial run this, okay? I wanted to use the creepy baby picture. Don't worry, in a minute here when I was making this PowerPoint, I figured out that these graphs were gonna be really hard to read on the bottom, and we only have a few of these. So bear with me, I don't know why I didn't remake these slides. We don't have the highest production quality around here, I don't know if you can tell. But the average age of initial readers is pretty young here. This is like about 13 to 14 years old over here. This actually has a bunch of decimals at the bottom. I will not be telling you what those decimals are. We have no significant figures here, okay? But like 13 to 14-ish for the whole survey. And interestingly, our average age now looks more like a bell curve, this being kind of approximately the early to mid-20s range. I find that to be fascinating because that is my demographic. Women between the ages of like 18 and 30 is predominantly my YouTube audience. So it kind of makes sense that the average age that we got for answers to the survey is like right in that range, in like almost a perfect bell curve. Like that's actually just kind of fun. As a little bit of a statistics nerd, I enjoyed this a lot when this graph showed up. But that's not the interesting part about all of this. Buckle up, okay? Yeah, this is really hard to read, sorry. I think this is the last chart I have. So over here we have Edward and over here we have Jacob, and you can notice something very interesting here. So on the survey I asked, how old were you when you initially read it? How old are you now? Were you on Team Jacob, Team Edward, neither team, or both teams when you first read it? And then what team are you on now with the same options? This was a trick, and I got you. I needed a control. And so the initial readers that answered neither or both became my control group, so I can compare them to the Edward and Jacob groups. And here we can see that the average age for both our Edward and our Jacob group is almost exactly 13 and a half upon initial read. Why is this interesting? First of all, the fact that it got so exact is kind of crazy, I'm not gonna lie. I told you I wasn't gonna give you significant figures, but I included this one just so you can understand how incredibly bizarre it is that I happen to get the same exact age calculation for both Team Edward and Team Jacob. But you know what's especially interesting about this is that the average age of our control group is 16. Interesting. So just to summarize, upon initial read, the average age for both Team Jacob and Team Edward is 13 and a half, but the average age for our control group is 16 years old. Also worth noting, I only had like 4 people answer both. The majority of the answers within the control group said neither, which allows me to conclude that the older you are when you read these books for the first time, the more likely you are to just feel like both of these boys suck, and that Bella deserves way better, which is the experience that I'm now having in my 20s. Fascinating. I was wondering if there was an age disparity between Team Edward and Team Jacob. Doesn't seem to be. The age disparity is between both Team Edward and Team Jacob and our control group. That's why you have a control, ladies. That's why we follow good statistic practices. Because you learn things. All right, so next up I asked, how old are you now and what team are you on now? The first line that we see here is the difference between Team Edward and Team Jacob and whether or not they switched from what they initially said. This is kind of confusing. So basically, if you answered Edward when you first read it and then you answered Jacob for the present day, then you ended up in this number, right? Whereas over here, it's like if you originally picked Jacob, but now you're Team Edward, that's how you ended up here. And you'll notice that there's a huge difference here. So only 12% of people who originally picked Edward switched to Team Jacob between then and now, but about 26%, a quarter of our friends who were originally Team Jacob have switched over to Team Edward. This is more than double the amount that have switched from Team Edward. That is significant to me. Now, I've admitted my bias here. I myself was a Team Edward girly when I was a child, but I have long been confused by our Team Jacob friends. I have been striving to understand you through making these videos, and seeing this just reinforces my feeling that Jacob never really was an option, and I think as people get older, they maybe realize that. Just saying. But even more interesting, here in this second category, we can see the number of people that switched from either Edward or Jacob originally to neither. 30%, pretty significant number, 30% of people who were originally Team Edward ended up on Team Neither. 42% of Team Jacob also is now in the neither camp. So going back to what I said about the average age upon initial read, the older you are when you read these books for the first time, the more likely you are to hate both boys. It also seems like as you get older, you just end up hating both boys anyway. So maybe it doesn't actually have anything to do with when you read the books for the first time, as much as it has to do with how old you are now, thinking about the series and what happens in it. 30% and 42% is a pretty significant number of people to have jumped into the neither category. Now here in our both category, we have 4% and 3%. That's not a lot. That's a pretty small number of people that have gone from liking one of the boys to liking both of them. So it seems like it's really not that common to really firmly be in the camp for one of these boys and then grow up a little bit and be like, actually, I love both of them. I can't choose. Not that common. Next up, we have our love languages. Buckle up. We are going to spend a minute here. This is fascinating. So we've got our Edward column, we've got our Jacob column, and we've got our control column. And over here, I have the love languages. Now, I'm sure I'm gonna get a comment about how they've kind of proven that these love languages are BS. I don't care. There's something to be said for what people pick for themselves that I think does tell us something about them. Even if just kind of generally speaking, we can't boil down love to these 5 things. Also, worth noting, for this one, I allowed people to pick multiple. So the percentages are really high and they're not gonna add up to 100. Honestly, none of these percentages are gonna add up to exactly 100 because I allowed people to skip questions. But when I was like doing the math at the end, I was just using the overarching number of people who answered the survey because it was way easier for me. We're just having fun here. Like I said, this isn't getting peer reviewed, okay? So you might see some confusing percentages that don't add up to 100%. That is why. So this is based off of initial read. So when you first read the books, were you Team Edward, Team Jacob, or neither or both? And then what you answered for love languages. So for words of affirmation, we can see we have 53% for Edward, 38% for Jacob, and 46% in our control. Now, I do feel like Edward is more complimentary of Bella than Jacob is, so this makes sense to me. I do think it's interesting that the control group is higher than Jacob. It goes Jacob, control, and then Edward in like the tier. So if we imagine that about half of the population likes to be complimented, that's why they say the love languages are BS. It's kind of like everybody likes all these things, but if we assume here that half the population would pick words of affirmation out of a list of things that are more important to them maybe than some of these other things, then it's interesting to see that Jacob is sitting at around that 38% mark and Edward is over that 50% mark. Because Edward is very verbally affectionate towards Bella. He compliments her all the time, something that isn't as common for Jacob. It's not that Jacob never compliments Bella, it's just that Jacob only ever really compliments Bella in proximity to himself and his feelings towards her. In my memory, wait, I can do a puppet. I don't know like any, oh, there we go. Shadow puppet? We're just going off my memory, but I remember Edward being more complimentary towards Bella than Jacob is in the books. So I think it kind of makes sense that words of affirmation is high for our Edward girlies. Next, we have acts of service. Now, this is an interesting one. So for acts of service, 48% of our Edward friends are fans of acts of service, 65% for Jacob, and control is 46%. So again, with our control, we're sitting at about that 50% mark. And yet now Edward is almost exactly where the control is at. They're only apart by like 2%. And yet Jacob's all the way up in the 65%. This also makes sense when you think about the plot of these books. Jacob fixes up the bikes for Bella. He helps her in a very tangible way when she is missing Edward. She has talked about this at length in her own mind about why Jacob is so important to her, because he was there for her when Edward was gone. And also in Eclipse, he like jailbreaks her, and when there's stuff that she wants to do that Edward won't let her do, Jacob is like super on board. So I feel like that also kind of tracks that like acts of service would be a bigger deal for people who are big fans of Jacob, because Jacob tends to like do a lot for Bella. He shows his affection in that way. Next, we have quality time. Everybody put really high for quality time, right? 65% for Edward, 80% for Jacob, and then 73% in our control. So we've got Edward kind of here, and then the control, and then Jacob for quality time. I think that also makes sense because truthfully, we haven't really seen Edward and Bella spend that much quality time together even up to now. They get a lot of that in Breaking Dawn, but up to now their time together is like very strenuous and there's always some kind of major thing happening. Whereas when Bella and Jacob are bonding, it's essentially an entire book of just like them hanging out, them having quality time. So again, it kind of makes sense that if quality time is really important to you, that you would be drawn towards Jacob. That being said, I have another theory about this that I can't really dive too in depth with until we get to the bottom. So table that. We're gonna move on to physical touch. This I also found to be so interesting. So for physical touch, 66% of our Edward friends said physical touch, 38% for Team Jacob, and 40% for our control. So Jacob is sitting right about where the control is, but Edward pops all the way up to 66%. Interesting. This is fascinating to me because objectively, Edward as a boyfriend would be a horrible partner for somebody who craves physical touch. He is freezing to the touch for Bella, and he cannot really like cuddle her. It remarks how often he has to put a quilt over her or between his body and her when they're cuddling so that she doesn't freeze. And also, he is like very strong, and remarks at many points that he has to be very careful when he's touching her because if he's not paying attention, he could just crush her skull like a melon. So why is it that our physical touch girlies are drawn to the man that would be the worst for them in the physical touch range? Not just out of our options, but like in general. Of all the men that Bella could have had in the world, she genuinely picked the worst one if you like physical touch as a form of affection. What I kind of am thinking in my head, I'm curious to hear what you guys think about this one. Comment down below and let me know if you agree with me, but the way that I'm rationalizing this is that we actually watch Edward and Bella cuddle a lot in the books. Even if logistically we know it would probably be a better experience to cuddle with Jacob than it is to cuddle with Edward. Jacob is very warm. Jacob is a very large man. He could really like encapsulate you, which is what every woman wants, is to be encapsulated. Our dream man, a sensory deprivation tank. But anyway, we know that logically speaking, Jacob would be a better cuddler than Edward, but we never really see Bella and Jacob cuddle that often, whereas Bella and Edward are incredibly physically affectionate with each other. And as a frequent purveyor of romance novels, I can tell you that it is very easy and convenient to forget facts about men that you don't like. For example, when romance heroes are described with long hair, no, they're not. That's not something I'm really into. So I just always picture them with short hair, and whenever I'm like reminded of the fact that they have long hair, I'm like, oh. That's also how I feel when I read fantasy novels, and maybe the guy has like wings or something, and they bring it up during the sex scenes, and they almost become part of the sex scenes. I don't like it. Not for me. Get that away from me. I want to forget that he has wings. The amount of times I've been in the middle of a fantasy romance and it's just like brought up in the middle of a sex scene that the guy has wings and I'm just like, oh my God, I completely forgot about that. And I wanted to forget about that and I'm kind of upset that I got reminded about that. I'm calling you out, ACOTAR. Apparently there's also one with a guy with a tail that I genuinely have avoided reading because people talk about that with the books, that like the tail is a part of this. Listen, I can imagine how, and I don't want it. I don't want to read it. I'm not going to. My imagination is enough. My imagination is a curse in this circumstance, actually. I'm getting very off topic. My point is that I think that Twilight readers can somewhat conveniently forget that cuddling with Edward would be a very cold experience. And also that he's like stone, right? He's like literally described as being made of granite and like freezing solid. Like who wants to cuddle with a statue? And yet, our Edward girlies are our physical touch girlies. So I think it's just because we see them cuddle and be very physically affectionate with each other a lot. And Bella and Jacob never really get that. So there's nothing really for the Team Jacob girlies as far as like physical touch goes. You see what I'm saying? And finally, we have receiving gifts. Now, I spelled this wrong on the survey, and that's horrifically embarrassing. I have a YouTube channel about books, but I cannot read or spell, apparently. Anyway, I think I spelled it right here. I hope so. That would be so funny if I didn't. I before E except after C. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So you can see that for Edward, it's at 18%. For Jacob, it's at 15%. And for Control, it's at 13%. Now, this is pretty negligible. These numbers are pretty close together. So what I actually deduced from this is that people don't like admitting that they like receiving gifts. I think of the options over here on the side, receiving gifts feels like the most callous of all of these, because the rest of them have to do with like the relationship and the partner and how they treat you. And choosing receiving gifts kind of implies that you like material things. And so it's like bringing material things into a relationship, which sounds callous. And so people don't choose it when they choose their love languages for themselves. I said I was going to come back to quality time with another theory. This is also my theory about quality time. I think of all the things on this list, quality time sounds like the nicest thing to choose. Basically, that the best way your partner can show their affection for you is by spending time with you, and that alone is a form of love for you. That should be true for anybody that's in a relationship, but if you're picking out of a list, picking quality time makes you feel like you're a nicer person than picking receiving gifts. Because quality time is like, I like my partner and they're all I need, and receiving gifts is like, all my partner is to me is what they can offer me materially. So I think that's why we see such a big spike in quality time in comparison to the rest of these, and such a low spike in receiving gifts. But allow me, as a proud member of the receiving gifts community, to explain to you why that's bullshit. Okay, anybody that knows me in real life would say I am a good gift giver, okay? This is a point of pride for me. I'm very good at giving gifts, and I love receiving a good gift in return. Why? Because this is the only thing on this list that shows that your partner understands you. It's not about the item itself. It's about the person showing you that they understand you and that they can pick a gift out for you that is something that you would really enjoy. It shows that they know you and that they know the kind of things that you would like, that they're aware of what your preferences are, and then can choose something out for you that is something that you would like based off of the things that you like. So to me, receiving gifts on this list of love languages, it's not about the material item. It has nothing to do with liking to have items that your partner gave you. And not only that, but when your partner has given you items, or really when anybody's given you gifts, and then you use those gifts, you think about those people. I have some gifts that I've been given that I adore and cherish, and when I use them, I think about the person who gave them to me, and it makes me happy. And it makes me feel loved. It's not about the item, it's about the love that went into choosing that item, and then the love that you basically continue to get to have by continuing to use that item and remembering that that person thought of giving that to you, showing you that they understand you. I actually think that's why receiving gifts is on this list, because none of the other love languages here really show that like deep understanding of you and your interests. But I just think that nobody chose receiving gifts because they don't want to feel materialistic. And that was my argument for why it's not materialistic to enjoy receiving gifts. Myers-Briggs is way too hard, you guys. I partially think we didn't have really enough of a sample size to make it work. But I also think it was kind of the way that I had people answer the question. I should have put like some kind of weird question where I had you put each individual letter in, trying to get any data out of just like where people just typed in the letters, and some people had like a fifth letter and other people didn't. So I don't know. I just ended up being like, you know what? We're not going over the Myers-Briggs. So sorry, everybody. Here we have the zodiac. I hope you can read this. I'm not sure if this is going to show up because it's kind of small. So also due to our small sample size, there's very little to cover here. I'm not going to go through each zodiac sign in depth, but I want to call out a few really interesting things. The first is that if we look here at Team Jacob, we're pretty consistent across the board, except for a few key zodiac signs. Scorpios, Aquarius, and Pisces all seem to really like Jacob. Whereas if we look over at Edward, we get spikes with Gemini, Leo, Libra, and Pisces. So the only overlap here is with Pisces, which I find to be very interesting, especially when we look over here and we realize that we also have 20% of our control group answering Pisces. So I think Pisces just like to answer surveys or watch a lot of YouTube, not sure which it is. But even more interesting, when we go over into our control group, we can see there's these big swatches where we just like didn't get answers. So we got Aries. We did get a Taurus. This is 6%, not 0. Then we've got Cancer, Virgo, Libra, Aquarius, and Pisces. So is it just Pisces or is it all water signs that like to answer surveys? or watch a lot of YouTube, or watch my channel a lot. I myself am a water sign. I'm a Cancer. So maybe we've just bonded. Maybe you guys can just like sense that, you know, or maybe you guys like watching YouTube, or maybe you like answering surveys. I don't know. I don't know anything about the zodiac, everything, to be completely honest with you. A lot of this means nothing to me. But if any of you can conclude anything else interesting from this, there you go. All right, next up. So this is one of the random things that I found that's so fascinating to me. So one of the questions was, are you on your phone or your desktop right now? So for both our control group and our Team Jacob group, we can see that it's pretty evenly split 50-50. And yet, when we go over to our Team Edward group, we can see that 75% said they were on their phone and 25% said they were on their desktop. Our chronically online phone-addicted girlies are the Team Edward girlies. It's all I can conclude from this. By the way, I'm using girlies as a gender-neutral term here. Okay. Next, we have cats and dogs. Now, this is another place where I found something incredibly fascinating, and this is why we run statistics. Because I would have assumed, for obvious reasons, that people who are fans of dogs would have been fans of Jacob. That's not what we found here at all, okay? So for the most part, everything's kind of hovering in the same range, except for in our Jacob category, we noticed something very interesting. Actually, very few of you said that you like dogs. And I feel like it's almost because you were kind of annoyed by the question, like, oh, seriously, she's gonna ask us if we like cats or dogs. Like, of course she thinks the Team Jacob girlies are gonna answer dogs. You saw right through me there, and it showed up in the statistics. But then also in the both category, this is really high, whereas for both the control group and the Edward group, they're around the same. They're in like the 20% range, whereas Jacob's at 42% for both. I don't know if it's just because you would have picked dogs, but you didn't want to, because then it would show up as dogs on here and you kind of knew what I was doing. Or if genuinely Team Jacob girlies are just more likely to like both cats and dogs and not be able to choose one. I'm not really sure what to conclude with that, honestly. I just find it to be really interesting that for some reason the both was really, really high for Jacob. I don't know why. This is our last chart. I asked if you were a morning person, a night person, or both. I was also expecting a lot of the Team Edward people to say night. He is a vampire after all. However, that actually wasn't really the case. A disproportionate number of the Edward fans said they were a morning person, which I was not expecting. And I don't know if it's the same as what I just said about Jacob, where you guys kind of like figured out what I was doing and didn't want to answer that you were a night person because you're like, oh, he's a vampire. Like, she wants to be able to say like, oh, look, night people like the vampire. In fact, significantly less people said they were a night person if they picked Edward in comparison to the control and Jacob, which were about even. So that kind of reinforces that for me, that either something about Edward, like maybe because he never sleeps, so people who like to be up early in the morning when nobody else is awake, like him, I don't know, are drawn to him. That's the only other thing I can think. The other thing that I found interesting is that for the both category, both Edward and the control were about the same, but the Team Jacob was at 8%. So our Team Jacob girlies are either vehemently night people or vehemently morning people, and they predominantly are night people according to this. So what can we conclude? Remember, our goal was to discover whether or not we could predict if somebody was going to end up being Team Edward or Team Jacob upon their initial read based off of a few key factors. So a few things we know for sure. Age really matters, but it doesn't matter Edward versus Jacob. The younger you are when you read these books for the first time, the more likely you are to pick either Edward versus Jacob. The older you are when you first read these books, the more likely you are to dislike both of these boys and not really pick either of them. So age is kind of out of the question, but what about the rest of it? If you are somehow a phone-addicted morning person who's a big fan of physical touch and words of affirmation, also are vehemently either a dog or a cat person, and are one of a few key zodiac signs that I can't remember right now, but just go back to that part of the video because I said it then that's how we'll know if someone's going to be Team Edward as opposed to Team Jacob, who seem to be predominantly night people who watch YouTube on their desktop, who refuse to pick between cats and dogs, love quality time with their partner, and are also of the zodiac signs that I mentioned back in that other slide. That's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed. I'm really trying to beef up my Instagram, and I feel like doing these kinds of surveys and things would be way easier on Instagram as opposed to on YouTube. So I was kind of thinking it would be fun to do like a subscriber special, right? If I get to a certain amount of subscribers, maybe I rerun the survey with a way bigger sample size. But that felt kind of weird, especially considering the fact that as of filming this, I only have 5,000 subscribers. So it feels a little weird be setting a goal like 100,000 subscribers right now, which I guess is equally as weird to do on Instagram, but going just to 10,000 doesn't feel like it would make a big enough difference to the sample size that I had now to make it worth it. So I'll leave it up to you guys. Do you want it to be like a subscriber special? Do you want it to be like an Instagram follower special? for me to rerun the survey with a much bigger sample size, because presumably I would have a bigger audience at that point. I mean, by definition, I would have a bigger audience. That's the point. And then I can rerun the survey and get a lot more data and compare it to this and see if we get the same answers. Let me know what you guys would prefer down below. Let me know what you thought of this style of video. I had a ton of fun doing this. I would totally do something like this again. I love you guys. Let me get it in the shadow. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.